This week we brought the Antiques Roadshow to the south coast and to that archetypal seaside resort of Bournemouth. Now, because it is so famous as a holiday centre, one is perhaps tempted to think that Bournemouth has been here forever and a day. Not so. In fact, it isn't much more than 100 years old. It all started in the 19th century with just one large house, a cottage for the butler, and a pub. Then came the Victorian love affair with the seaside, and thereafter, Bournemouth, like Topsy, just grew and grew. In 1851, there were only a few hundred people here. Now there are more than 140,000, including a large proportion of those who perhaps came to Bournemouth first on holiday, liked what they saw, and decided to retire here. Thomas Hardy wrote of Bournemouth's numerous fanciful residences with their towers, gazebos, and lofty roofs, a Mediterranean lounging place on the English Channel. Well, now, because of intense competition from the real Mediterranean, Bournemouth can no longer just rely on the tourist trade, and they've built a large convention and conference centre on the cliffs overlooking the beach. And that's where we've set up our cameras today. Among our experts this week, we have on porcelain Sebastian Pearson and Terry Lockett, who we saw for the first time a few weeks ago in Liverpool. Peter Nahum is our picture expert here in Bournemouth, and we're also very happy to welcome back John Bly for the first time in this series.
When I was about 5 or 6 years old, I used to sit on the neighbour's stairs and cuddle it. I used to think it was lovely. And it was always promised to me, and I waited over 40 years for it.
Well, in date, he's about 1870. And he's made by a firm called Brown Westhead Moore & Co., a Stoke-on-Trent factory, who specialised at that time, like a lot of firms did, in making what was called majolica. Majolica was an attempt to look like Italian maiolica, but the English called it majolica, and it was very popular, especially for ornamental pieces in houses, in gardens, and you put jardiniers on the top of this. It's a stand for a jardinier. So, lacking its jardinier, it's a shame really, but he's still a very impressive piece. Over the 100 years or so of its life, it's had a little bit of chipping and damage, but it's still a very impressive piece. So I'm sure you're delighted to have him and cuddle him.
Yes.
Do you still cuddle him at home?
No, not really.
You don't now. You've got over those sorts of things. But have you any idea what it's worth?
Well, I mean, it's the modern sort of Jardine stand with a pot you see about £75, but
Yes.
I think it's worth a bit more than that.
You think it's worth a bit more than that?
So,
Well, you may be surprised that one very, very closely similar to this was sold in a London auction not too long ago, about a year or so ago, and it went for, I think it was £5,000. Now, don't get too excited.
Oh, no.
It is a little damaged, but not too badly.
Yeah.
But the problem is that the Americans a year ago were buying majolica up like mad, and the prices had zoomed up through the roof, but the Americans have dropped out of buying majolica now, so the prices have come down a bit. So I should confidently expect this, if it went into auction, to fetch something like about £3,000. So carry on cuddling it. And,
oh, yes. Oh, it's lovely. Oh, God.
it was great.
Oh.
Oh.
Isn't it absolutely super? Lovely little pig. But how did you come by him?
It was on a bric-a-brac stall at a street fair about 3 years ago.
And can I ask you what you paid for him?
20 pence.
20 pence. Right. He was actually made, let's just have a look at the marks there. He was made in Birmingham in 1911. In Birmingham in 1911. But say 2 lots of collectors that will go for it. There are collectors of pigs. A lot of pig collectors actually around the place. And there are also, of course, the collectors of pin cushions. So, a little pig like that, actually the small ones are the most desirable ones.
And that's considered small?
That's considered a small one, yes. Normally they're about twice as big as that. they don't often go much larger than that, but the little ones are difficult to get hold of. So at 20p, now, today, I would expect him to sell at least 120, if not 150 pounds.
Good grief. That's not a bad return, is it?
Not a bad return.
Do you know anything about this painting?
Not at all.
Not at all?
No, nothing.
This is a family picture?
No, I bought a place and it was furnished and it was in the house.
Well, that's wonderful.
I didn't pay anything for it.
Well, it's painted by a lady called, as you can see, Mrs. Withers.
Mrs.
And she is called Augusta Innes Withers. She was born in 1793. And she's not really known for sporting birds at all, although when you find them, they're glorious, like this painting, with the beautifully detailed feathers, and she's a marvellous illustrator of sporting birds. The reason she's not very well known in sporting bird circles is that she's extremely well known in horticultural circles. In fact, she was flower painter to two queens. To Queen Adelaide, who was William IV's wife in the 1830s, and then to Queen Victoria. And she also was very famous for illustrating a book on orchids. So she's really a rare, beautiful, fascinating artist. Just recently there was a sale in London when the pictures, there were some rare botanical illustrations by her, which did extraordinarily well. And the two best ones made £12,000 and £14,000. This painting, if it were by Archibald Thorburn, the famous man, might be worth, say, in the region of £30,000 today. Mrs. Withers is not so famous. I think she's equally as good, and being much rarer, you know, an exceptional painting to find. But, I mean, she's equally as good, so I think we could say around £15,000.
Oh my God. Really?
Yes, I think so.
Goodness me. Oh. I just threw it in the back of the car as I came here.
Well, what a stunning clock case, isn't it? Absolutely wonderful thing. From the great age of English marquetry. As far as dating is concerned, reasonably accurately, I suppose the shape of the bonnet top, as well as the marquetry itself, would give it post-1700 rather than just before, 1700, 1710.
Yeah.
And as a bit of English furniture, this is cabinet making at its best. This is the age, I think, which has never been surpassed. And I love the way this whole thing has mellowed into a black and gold picture. When it was new, it was primary colours, reds and blues and greens and so forth. In fact, probably more acceptable now.
Yeah.
What is interesting to see in its construction, first of all, I love the way the walnut is put on herringbone, but in the solid, and then shaped afterwards. All these mouldings, both the top on the hood and at the base, are all done in the same way, and that stopped around about 1740 anyway. Never done again, certainly not with mahogany. So, of the walnut period, perfect example of structure. And if we open the door, that's good. You see there's an oak lining. That's the only time, in fact, in English furniture that you'll find walnut, marquetry applied to oak. On anything else other than a clock door, it's always on pine or lime or something like that. And this, too, is nice. That cleat across the top, the door has actually shrunk this way. Wood will always shrink with across the grain, never along it. So this actually sticks slightly proud. And if we close it, you can see it's almost a wasted effect, which is repeated on the bottom of the door. You could never fake that. It would never be reproduced. It is a lovely thing to see. As far as the movement's concerned, really that's the province of my colleague here today, Simon Bull, and I'll go and get him.
What date did John Bly tell you for the case?
Around 1710, I think.
Well, that would confirm what I know about Richard Taylor, who I think was working sometime around about 1644-45 through till 1719.
Right.
And I believe he was a member of the family of clockmakers that rebelled against the Clockmakers' Company administration in the 1660s. But of course, Taylor's a name that's very common, and so there are a lot of makers having the same name. But I should think that's probably the one. It's had somewhat restoration, actually, the movement. This hand here is, I would think, a replacement, certainly. It's rather on the heavy side.
Yes, it is. I made it, actually, because the original hand was chronologically inaccurate.
Well, you've done a good job on the fretting. It's the sculpting it needs, the undercutting.
Yeah.
This, I think, is probably basically all right, but has been repaired.
That's right, yes.
And I think you'll agree the second's hand it's rather clumsy, isn't it? It's quite a heavy hand. That would have been just a finer rod. Yeah. But these are all signs on the movement here of a date of about 1700. Yeah. The ringing of the winding holes, this cutting of circles into the winding holes, and if we can move on, this engraving of flowers and rather elaborate around the calendar aperture. Yeah. And again, these spandrels with the cross and the crown and the cherub. Typical bold numbers, typical of the period. One small point, which I don't think is anything to be concerned about on this clock, but if I just put the movement up on here, generally, the seat board sits on the tops of the sides of the case. Yes. Now, this has been built up with these supports here. Yes. That is not a good sign, because it can mean that the movement has been replaced. Because if you fit another movement in the clock, then if it's too low, if it doesn't fit properly in the door, of course you build up or break or cut down the sides. Yes, but because these have been taken down by such a large distance, there are differences between these clocks, one room and another, but not 1.5 inches. And what I suspect happened is that maybe the original seat board and nails, which this looks to be the original seat board, the big nails being driven in and pulled out and driven, probably may have so badly cracked the top section that they cut it off flush and fitted these blocks, spliced it. Because we do have, as John was commenting on the marquetry and this movement too, it is a classic of the period. And so I think it's pretty much certain that it does belong.
Good.
So on that basis, that it is its original movement and a particularly good marquetry, price of value, always has to have a value, up to 10,000.
Yes.
I bought them just last week, but I was told that the reason I was interested, I was told it was a Wolf Mason. And that it was
from Liverpool, yes.
Yes, but that it was hand painted.
Both of those, I think, are right. Yes.
Right. But when I looked up in the reference book, it said that they never did this. They never hand painted this design.
Well, don't always believe everything you see in reference books.
That's why I brought it to you.
But the border is actually not quite exactly like the excavated shards. There were pieces dug up in Liverpool.
It goes very well with a bow tie, this. Anybody got a piece of straw?
I forgot to bring it, sir.
Right. You look very angelic.
This smock has been. This lady tells me it's been in her family since when?
It was made from my grandfather's grandfather.
Fantastic. The workmanship in smocks never ever ceases to amaze me. I've only ever. I think it's probably 5 or 6 years ago since I ever saw one of these things. It's definitely not me. He was a big lad, wasn't he? Big bloke, yes. Well, everybody has shoulder pads these days, don't they? You know, everybody walks around like an American footballer today. But I was just saying, they usually make about they can make 300 plus.
But there's just a doubt in my mind that it might be copal. Is that what you thought?
Yeah, well, that was the alternative.
Yeah, that's the alternative. It's one of the two. I'm just a little bothered about it. And the only way to tell, actually, is to put the shard next to it. You know, you'd have to have the piece. And then you'd know what you were doing. But it's a nice piece.
I just looked her up. She was made in 1914. So manufactured. Yes. But that's wonderful. 5 shillings.
It was a lot of money. You could get a very nice doll for 6pence when I was growing up in 1919 and 1920.
Well,
but of course, the whole thing is a closed mouth.
We call that a watermelon mouth.
Oh.
Because it's got this funny little grin on it, and her eyes do close. You know that?
Yes.
They're a bit stuck at the moment.
They still close.
Well, they don't want to.
Yeah, that's right, yes.
They do close.
And they're called googlies, googly eyes.
Googly eyes, but she does close. They do close. Go on, darling.
Shall we give her a tap?
There they are, they're closing. What can I do about that?
Don't worry about it. It's much better to leave it. Because if they're
standing for years, you see.
Yes, if they fall inside, it's quite difficult to get them put back. But your 5 shillings has now become about £800.
Oh. Well, darling, you're going up in value, aren't you? Little Rosalie.
Rosalie. She's a very pretty...
I wouldn't dream of selling her.
No.
Cigarette cases, I'm afraid, are terribly unsaleable. One of the most unsaleable things that come on the market today. And it was actually pre the government's anti-smoking campaign. It went back to the days when we had these nice, strong cardboard cigarette packets. So we can't blame the warnings for that. And of course, lots of today's cigarettes won't fit anyway. Yeah. But the nice thing about this, of course, is it's Russian.
Yeah.
Now, having said that cigarette cases are unsaleable, the really nice enamel ones are collectible. And once they're collectible, then the price goes on. So this is a nice one. It's Russian. It's 84% silver. We don't use that standard at all. It's much lower than our standard, so we use 92.5. But this is 84% silver. But it's very, very nicely Cassoni enamelled. And the nice thing, I think, about this one in particular is the nice muted colours. A lot of Russian Cassoni enamel is in these very gaudy colours, but I think both the cigarette case and the napkin ring are very, very nice muted colours. Again, the thing that's unusual about this one, and I haven't seen before, is this lovely hunting scene on the front. It's nice. I've never seen that before on a case like this. You see them on the English cases all over, but not on the Russian ones. It's pre-revolution. The marks actually indicate it was made around about 1908, which again fits in with the hunting scene. And as I say, very collectible. And today's market, I should think you should get something in the region, probably anything for £500 to £700 or £800 for it. You know, it's very, very collectible. Had it been an ordinary cigarette case, it would have gone in the melting pot for 30 quid. And the same thing really applies with this. You see, it's a very ordinary napkin ring. The reverse happens with napkin rings, they're always very saleable. But this in particular, nice muted colours, funny enough, by the same maker as this one. And a little napkin ring like that today, in a Russian Works of Art sale, would bring something in the region probably £150, £200.
Not bad for napkin ring then.
No, it isn't.
Well, somebody came to my house when I was going to move down here.
Yes.
Because I wanted some valuations done.
Yes.
And looked up on the shelf and said, I see you have a Ming vase.
Yes, yes.
So I said, well, I didn't know it was a Ming vase.
Yes,
it was given to me many years ago by my father, who bought it in Paris. That was where he lived and I lived. And I've loved it and kept it preciously ever since, but I still don't know if it is a Ming vase.
Yes,
This is what he said.
Yes. Well, it's a nice thing. I think what's so charming about it is it has a cover. And often you see these small vases, which are, he's quite correct, and it is of the late Ming, early Qing dynasty.
Yes.
So it comes from a period known as a transitional period.
Yes.
And it's the sort of the first half of the 17th century.
Yes.
Made in China, as I say.
Yes, yes.
So he's absolutely right. Often they do crop up without lids.
The lids,
so it's a pity, and they lack the sort of balance.
The
it's a nicely shaped
is pretty,
pot.
isn't it?
Well, yes, the colour is so-called wu cai, which means 5 colours.
Yes.
You count in Chinese, you have yi, sun, ser, wu. Okay.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
if you counted the number of colours here, that's in fact what they employed to make this.
Yes.
Actually.
Yes.
If I'll take the cover off so we can have a look here.
Yes.
It's a very attractive, typical Chinese scene here. The dignitary receiving a visit from a child.
Yes.
In the mountain retreat.
Yes.
With plantains here and blue rocks. But the design is very bold, and the whole thing is a very attractive thing to look at. It does have two. You noticed, obviously, or somebody's no doubt brought this to your attention. It has a little hair crack here, which is a pity, quite frankly.
It is a pity.
It's not worth fortunes or many thousands.
No,
it couldn't possibly be because of it has a hair crack
Yes,
here, and there are.
yes.
They're not uncommon.
No.
But having said that, it's a very attractive object, and I think with its cover, it would probably be worth in the region of £550, £650.
Would it? Yes.
Within good condition, at least double.
Yes.
More. Probably.
Yes.
An amputation set, obviously. Here you've got the tourniquet, if we can run through the gory detail. The tourniquet with its rather nice little velvet fitting here would be clamped round the offending member to be cut off. Then you have one of these knives, if I can take one out without cutting myself, and leave it at the edge here, which would be for severing through the main tissue, and then the saw for going through the bone. So, if I can take that out as well, finally you've got, after everything is done, you've cut the sinews with the pincers there, and you've finally got the job of sewing up whatever's left. This type of knife has an ebony handle or perhaps a bakelite handle. I think with this Weiss moulding on it, the name of the maker is Weiss, London, it's going to be before 1880. These were used as recently, you can find descriptions of them being used in the First World War. Yeah. Almost in every man's kit for chopping off limbs. These are called Liston knives after a famous surgeon called Robert Liston who used these with great effect. Apparently, he could get a leg on the sawdust within about 2.5 minutes. There's a very nasty story, which I'm going to tell you, of him operating so fast that not only did he remove the offending limb, but he also took one of his assistant's fingers and the patient's testicles. The reason for this very fast speed was because if you operated slowly, the patient went into shock. Yeah. So it had to be done as quickly as possible. And Liston, a big burly man, used these to great effect. Did you buy it?
I bought it, yes.
Can I ask you what you paid for it?
400.
I think that's about the right price. Yeah. I was going to hoping I was going to be able to tell you more,
really?
But I don't think it would be a lot more.
Yeah.
It's a comparatively simple set. If it contained more gruesome things or more specialist knives, an interesting saw perhaps, that would push the value up. But I think £400 is not far off the right price.
It was given to me by my grandmother about 15 years ago as a typewriter table to stand a typewriter on because it was a fairly solid table.
How wonderful. Well, originally it was an architect's table. Or that's the general term for this sort of writing or reading table. Inside the drawer, now there are no longer, there should have been at one time a fitment, a sliding tray, which went in these rebates or rabbets along the top here, which would have had a leather or cloth-coloured top. And you can see the various places where there were fitments inside. So that was basically a fitted drawer. Look at the cross-banding, the way the drawer front is veneered downwards, okay? That was something that you'll find up to about 1745, 1755. And that wonderful great big plate on here, that lock, that escutcheon is a tremendous thing. And you can't imagine putting something as important as that on something that didn't contain valuable papers and so forth. So you have 1745, 1740, along the top front and all the way around, in fact, you've got the veneer, or the border, is laid on edgeways. Again, continuing this downward. Stopped by 1750, 1755, went out of fashion, and during the later periods would have been applied in strips with the grain going along. Having said all that, you've then got a line inlay, which was not fashionable in 1745, 1750. So all this white line or gold line inlay, you see, was put in to bring it up to date in the 1770s, 1780s. There's a slight Gothic influence there. And I would presume at that time they took the insides out of the table, out of the drawer. Now you've got a rising top, which works on a button, right, back here. And this part shoots up and supports the book. Now, actually, nobody else could see that, so if I ask you to lift underneath, we'll do some furniture moving. How's that? Right, up we go. We'll turn it right the way round. That was the clip. Okay, I'll let you press this time. Good-o. There we are. Now, there is the rising action on this sort of little cut spaces here, these graduated spaces to give you the right angle. And this clever little bookrest is operated by these spring clips. Right. It's a jolly difficult thing to value. I mean, have you had any?
No, we haven't.
Because in its original condition, it would have one very high price. And in this condition, obviously considerably less. For insurance purposes, even in this condition, it's something you have to consider around about 2,500.
Well, it's certainly a good day for Venice today. This is the second beautiful view we've seen of Venice. Tell me how you came by it.
I've actually got a pair of them.
Have you?
Yes, both of Venice, both by the same artist. And really, I was clearing a friend of mine's flat, and she'd had them in the cellar for about 15 years, and gave them to me about 3 years ago.
People are extraordinary how they have beautiful possessions and don't put them on the wall,
Don't
aren't
use
they?
them.
Because this is a beautiful painting.
It's beautiful. I love them both, yes.
I mean, it's interesting because the other view of Venice showed a more Victorian view of Venice, if you like, a little brighter and harder.
Yes.
This shows that end of the day when it's soft and the light is gentle, perhaps more the feeling of the Impressionists rather than the Victorian and Pre-Raphaelite artists.
Yes.
And I think it's gorgeous. I mean, these soft washes. And it's interesting, George Cockram did paint a lot. I mean, he painted Venice later in life because he lived a very long life.
Oh, did he?
Yes, he was born in 1861 and didn't die till 1950. But I would think, just from the quality of framing and the gold slip, that this must be between 1900 and 1910, I would have thought so, yes. Yes. So have you thought about value at all?
No, I mean, no, I just like them, and no, they're not particularly insured, or no, not at all.
Well, I won't talk about the pair. I'll talk about this one because I can see it. I think it's just a lovely thing, and I think in the region of £800 to £1,200.
Good gracious.
To get the foot, what they did was to take a gather of glass on a rod, spin the rod, which flung the glass out, and then they trimmed round the edge and applied it to the stem. The result is you get what's called a puntal mark on the foot here, and the rod is simply broken off that, so it's quite rough. It's a sign of a handmade glass, but in this country, an 18th century glass.
Yeah, can I plead with you to take these wires off these edges? Do you have them hanging on the wall?
Yes. My mother-in-law
always had them on the wires.
Yes, and that's on.
They're doing damage.
Yes, that was over 50 years ago. When I displayed
Can I take them off?
You can do, yes.
What you do is you just push the wire up very gently and release one.
Yes. How can I display them on the wall?
Anyway, if you want to do them on the wall, you can get some plastic coated one.
The engraving is probably a bit later. The glass itself, 1770-ish, I suppose. The engraving could be added to 1800. It's not so important. The rarity of this glass is the two-coloured twist, the red and the white. It does have a slight chip on the foot, very, very slight, not really too important. It's worth about £500 to £700, and is a rare glass because of this colour twist.
No idea.
Well, I think it's a box for carrying medicaments used by the Chinese. I don't know how old it is. It was given to my husband by a missionary who came back from China.
Really? It's possible it came from China, but if it did, it has made its way there from Japan. Because in fact it's Japanese.
Yes.
And it's a little nest of boxes called an in-row.
Yes.
And you're quite right, they were often used for carrying medicaments. They were also used for carrying seals. And they were worn because the Japanese, both the men and the women, wore the kimono. People think it's a woman's dress, but the men wore it as well. And the kimono's got no pockets. So if you wanted to carry anything around, you were sung. So what you did was to keep your... this splits, for example, just like that.
It does.
And of course the string keeps it together. What you did was to push... You had a net ski on here, you know, the little toggle.
Yes.
Carved of ivory or
Yes.
wood. That was fixed onto there. And you pushed it up through your belt like that. And of course it hung there. It was held in by the toggle. And it was worn at the waist. Now, of course, once the Japanese adopted Western dress, which they did in about 1875, the netsuke carvers were thrown out on the streets because the netsuke was no longer necessary. And the inro really became redundant.
Yes.
It wasn't any longer a practical object. So the netsuke carvers turned to carving large objects for sale to the Westerners. And the inro makers went on to make far more splendid objects, which were really no longer functional. Now, this thing is made of layers of gold lacquer. And probably something like 100 layers of lacquer to build that up. And you would get this fantastic build-up of different colours. You could see the different colours of layers of gold. And then when you get to the end, they started to introduce little tiny flecks of real gold. Here you can see it laid up into little squares. Actual foil gold. And then that's covered with a clear lacquer to protect it. And the amount of work that went into this was phenomenal. And of course, they've then done mother of pearl here. You've got stained ivory. You've got tortoise shell and horn. Very eccentric design here. We've got a lady being carried on the back of a blind man, wading through a stream, and she's preceded by her samurai, or protector. And I think he's probably... What's going to happen here, this strange devilish figure is called an oni. And I think this bloke is probably going to attack the procession. I think that's what's happening. Now, this bottom section is jammed, and I can see down inside the split there that it's actually cracked, and it won't allow me to pull it apart, so I won't try that. Have you ever thought about getting it valued or anything?
No, not really.
No.
It's the usual problem.
Would you part with it?
No, I'd rather not.
Not at all? No.
I don't think so, no.
No.
I'm very fond of it.
Right. Well, if you ever did decide to part with it, it would sell extraordinarily well. It's exactly the sort of fine quality Japanese object which is now very, very sought after, particularly by Americans. And I think even with that damage on it, that would make somewhere around £4,000 to £6,000.
Thank you.
Pleasant surprise.
Yes, indeed.
Well, I'm delighted to see 3 books in the most excellent condition, 2 illustrated by Rackham and 1 by Willie Pagani. The Dish of Apples with Eden Philpotts that he did, all of these are limited editions, typical Rackham illustrations. These obviously, well, dating from the 20s, which was Rackham's middle period, really. He was born in the early, in 1860, and his style didn't really come to fruition until about 1900, when he produced his first blockbuster, if you can actually call a book printed in 1900 a blockbuster. That was the Grimm's Fairy Tales. And I think in about 1905, another great blockbuster, he produced Rip Van Winkle, which made him a star both on this side of the Atlantic and in America. Again, very typically Rackham, this Comus by John Milton. From that period on, from about 1905 onward, Rackham was really tied up in the Christmas market, the gift book market. He would produce 40 or 50 illustrations to illustrate a popular author's work. They would produce it in a limited edition, or possibly an unlimited edition, which would be cheaper. Both these Rackhams here are limited editions sold as gift books, probably for Christmas. The third one here, which in fact I find the most interesting, is this Rime of the Ancient Mariner, illustrated by Willie Pagani. Pagani was somewhere about 20 years later than Rackham. He was born in the 1890s. And he was a Hungarian, very flamboyant, typically mid-European. And he was illustrating for Christmas books as well as Rackham, but he didn't stay with that. He went as far as illustrating for ballets, doing designs for ballets and theatres. And this style, as you can see, is very much more Art Nouveau. He worked in America. He went to work for Florence Ziegfeld of the Follies fame, Sigmund Romberg. But I think it's in his designs, particularly for ballet, the Ballet Russe, and for books like this, that his work is most appreciated from my point of view. And this also has a complete, delicious vellum binding, and in such good condition. Are you responsible for the condition?
Well,
I mean, did you
yes,
buy them when they came out, or what?
When I bought them, they were boxed, and they've been in the same boxes ever since.
Well, I congratulate you, because as a bookseller, I rarely say things are in absolutely mint condition, but these are about as mint as they come. And from a collector's point of view, they are as fine as you can get them. I would say the dish of apples is worth 100, 150 pounds. The Comus, obviously 200, 250, that sort of region. Yes. But the Ancient Mariner, I would say around 400, 450 pounds.
I have a very strong affinity with this lady. Now, by saying that, I'm not confessing to be a secret warlock or anything like that, but simply because I originate from Pendle witch country. So to see a witch in Bournemouth today was quite exciting for me. Have you been living with this witch for quite some time?
Well, it's been in my possession about 40 years.
Has it?
Yes.
Before then?
I don't know. I bought it in the sale room in Worthing about 40 years ago. My wife actually bought it.
Did she? The exciting thing about this bronze, because I find it an exciting bronze, okay, doesn't necessarily mean it's worth a lot of money, but it's exciting because the technique involved. This is almost certainly a serpent bronze. In other words, a lost wax process bronze. The lost wax process, quite simply, is one of the oldest forms of casting a bronze. In its most simple form, you take an object, you carve a sculpture in wax, you then encase it in a slip clay, which then solidifies. You bore a hole in the top, bore a hole in the bottom, and simply pour the bronze in after the actual encasement has solidified. And out comes the wax, and you're left with a solid impression. She's not really a sort of a witch that you would have found in Macbeth, is she? She's not really an ugly girl. She looks a bit simple, I think it's fair to say, but she's not ugly. And the other thing is that, I mean, are you actually still using it?
No, I haven't used it for a number of years now.
Right.
I did use it at one time when I had a big house and had a very high ceiling in the hall, and I used to put it in there as a sort of a glim light to keep it alight all the evening. Right.
I mean, if we can look at the far end, we can see that she's actually suspending a little lantern.
Yes.
And quite cleverly, each corner of the lantern is cast with the head of Mephistopheles.
Yes, I noticed that. And the snake on it as well.
And the snakes at the bottom.
Yes.
Yes. Can you remember just how much you paid her for this lady?
Well, my wife actually bought it at the time. I don't remember what she paid for it, but I know it was just a question of pounds. It wasn't certainly over £6 or £7.
Okay. Well, before we actually give you a price, I just should point out that the gentleman responsible actually for sculpting it.
Yes, I know his name on it.
Right. Well, it's down here, all right, and it's in the name of Schuler, a man called Hans Schuler, who was born in Lorraine in France in 1874, and exhibited in Paris, and then eventually he emigrated to America in about 1910. Whatever happened to him after that, I don't know. I know that he was in Maryland and Baltimore, but after that, I'm afraid he seems to have disappeared into obscurity, as so many French and East European artists did. Yes. But what I'm trying to say is that he's not a big name, and that, therefore, would probably put the price of this object between £800 to £1,200.
I believe it was given in lieu of money to my great-grandfather for medical services. And then it ended up in my parents' house at the bottom of the stairs, and they used to put their hats on it. But whether it came from a bed or I just don't know. I'd be interested to know what you thought.
Well, it's first of all, it's a very early piece of carving, from the very style and the colour and the quality of it. I'm quite certain this is mid-15th to late 15th century. And it is quite wonderful. I mean, it's contemporary with his costume. It can't be English.
No.
I think possibly German, or the area that we now call Germany, or it could be Flemish. But I think if we go for German, there's a sort of Germanic feel to it. I thought when I first saw it, it might have been from a pew, you know, a pew end. But I don't think you'd have a man with a tankard of beer at the end of the pew. So he might, therefore, because it's wonderful quality, he might come from either a very important bed, of which would have one of these on one side and one on the other, and or it might be an architectural fitting from, say, a burgomaster's house, even a barge, although I don't think it's been exposed to salt water, but might be an inland waterway, one of those enormous deck fitments. But the surface on here is not one, I think, that's been exposed to the elements for too long. It's quite wonderful. I mean, this is the dream colour to a collector of oak. This wonderful, thick, dark patina. Let's have a look at it now. I mean, his clothes are very sharply defined, very well carved, and it's a German-shaped tankard anyway. Originally, it sort of had a lid, but that's merely been broken off. I imagine that at the very top, it had a scroll of some sort right over, which has been taken off, but, a couple of 100 years ago because of the patina. You've got a shield here, which gives us little information at all, and then you've got the sort of the semi-draped lady supporting this shield, again, typical of that part of Europe and of this period. But the best thing of all are these serpents. When you look at it, it looks just scrolls, doesn't it? But when you look closely, this is actually a rather nasty serpent down here. He's with his mouth open. He's sort of throwing out sort of beads and more scrolls, which lead up. And then the next one, actually, from his mouth comes a torch. And look at his eye here.
Yes.
And his wicked mouth. And then from that comes another one. And there's another scroll, and then another serpent, and it comes right up to the top into flower heads. A most extraordinary thing. Goodness knows, I would love time to research and to find out where it could have come from. If I ever do, I'll let you know.
I'd be very interested.
Goodness knows, not an easy thing to value, but given its considerable age and quality and colour, nobody's ever stripped it or painted it, all of those things combined lead one, I would suggest, as a collector's item, that it should be valued in the region of £6,000 to £8,000.
Really?
Yes.
Oh.
Oh, yes.
I wouldn't have thought so much as that.
Well, it's a terribly rare thing, you see.
Oh.
Terribly rare. I mean, this figure alone is a work of art.
And so we come very nearly to the end of our day here in Bournemouth. As I was saying at the beginning of the programme, the hall where we're holding the Antiques Roadshow today was actually only opened a few years ago. It's a modern building. And as a result, a lot of the furniture in the old Bournemouth Pavilion, which is just across the road, was made redundant. They didn't need it anymore. There was a plan to have a great bonfire of it all, but wiser counsels prevailed, and it was stored in a boiler room from where this Edwardian chair was retrieved today. John Bly tells me now much in demand by interior decorators and valued at about £60, which may appear to be quite insignificant until you hear that Bournemouth has no less than 100 of them. And the moral to that story is, don't throw anything away if in any doubt. So our thanks to the people of Bournemouth for having us here today. We hope you'll join us next week at the same time when we go to the West Country. Until then, from here on the South Coast, goodbye.
The programme regrets that it can only give valuations at its recordings and not